Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. Day 74 of the war in Gaza, and Israel remains fully committed to its stated goal of fighting in Gaza to end Hamas rule. The military maneuvers have made great progress, and the coming weeks could see an end to the current stage of warfare, with pockets of Hamas resistance continuing. When asked about post-Hamas Gaza, U.S. officials talk about a revised Palestinian Authority, or revamped, that would be charged with the vast rebuilding and policing that would need to be done in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu says no Hamastan and no Fatahstan will rule in Gaza. For the U.S., a Palestinian state that includes both Gaza and Judea and Samaria would be the political vision for a long-term solution. Israeli leaders say that would be a reward to Hamas terrorism. Joining us to discuss are two men with very strong and very well-informed positions, I believe quite different views on the issues, but I know that we will keep the discussion civil. Dr. Gershon Baskin joins us from Jerusalem. Dr. Baskin is a leading expert on Palestinian affairs. And Dr. Dan Diker, I'd like to be one of the first to say Dr. Dan Diker, joins us via Zoom from the United States. He heads the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Dan, the first question is going to be for you, but before we start, I'd like you to hear this brief comment from U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
Ultimately, it's going to be up to the Palestinian people to work through their representation, and it will be up to those leaders of the Palestinian Authority to work through the types of steps that they need to take to reform and update the authority for the situation we face today. The United States will be a partner in that with them, respectfully, and we will be there to try to support their efforts to ultimately deliver a vision in which Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace and security.
Dan, the first question is going to be for you, but it's kind of a longish question. There's a leaked foreign ministry document envisioning the future of Gaza. It calls for Palestinians governing themselves, but with no capacity to threaten Israel. There's no role for the Palestinian Authority regarding security, complete freedom of action for the IDF, prevention of any rearming and enforcement of a full demilitarization, the establishment of buffer zones, oversight of the Philadelphia corridor to prevent smuggling from Egypt, and regarding civil governance, the document provides for an international mechanism to handle humanitarian services and envisions regional states like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE administering civilian life along with international organizations like UN agencies together with local elements not identified with Hamas. Dan, that's a document that I think you could have written. Did you write it? And if not, what are your thoughts about it?
Steve, I think a number of things have become clear since the October 7th mass murders in southern Israel. And one of them is that the Oslo conception, which this year has its 30th anniversary, has been a failure, and that the conception of Oslo, which is that the PLO would securitize the Palestinian areas under its control, and that has been a complete failure. Of course, Hamas, in a bloody coup in 2007, now controlled the Gaza Strip, from which it invaded Israel and mass murdered 1,300 Israelis, commensurate with 50,000 Americans, and kidnapped another 250 people, commensurate with 14,000 Americans in a 24-hour period. This calls for a completely new idea for how Israel must secure itself going forward in Gaza, of course, and also in Judea and Samaria. The Palestinian Authority, unfortunately, has failed to even condemn the Hamas mass murders of October 7th. And in fact, the Palestinian Authority has been a malign actor. They have engaged in massive incentivization to terror through the pay-to-slay program. They've engaged in Soviet and Nazi conspiracy theories. They have attempted to isolate Israel on the international scene. Their rhetoric, as my colleague Khalid Abu Tameh has said here in Florida and for many, many years, is actually quite similar to the Hamas's rhetoric. So we have woken up to a new morning in Israel in terms of Israel's responsibility to secure itself, and the Palestinian Authority has proven itself over 30 years not to be a partner, but to be the problem. And the entire security regime has to be completely rethought, reconsidered, and redesigned as we move forward following the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and in Israel since the Second Temple period.
All right, Gershon, what are Palestinian voices saying to you? How do they envision the future in Gaza? And is it one that Jews can live with? And by the way, I saw you recently reposted an article by a Syrian journalist who writes that living in Gaza currently is worse than living under ISIS rule.
So first, Steve, I think it's important to say that it's true that Gaza will no longer be Hamastan, but in the aftermath of this war, Israel will no longer be Bibistan. And there will be a need for us all to recognize that the 7 million Israeli Jews and the 7 million Palestinian Arabs who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea need to arrive at a point where we all recognize that we all have the same right to the same rights. If we don't arrive to that point, if we don't have a wake-up call after this horrific war that started with the bloody, murderous attack of Hamas on October 7th, then this is just going to be another round in a repeating round of violence between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people that's taken place for more than 100 years now. This needs to be the turning point. Israel needs to understand that the reoccupation of the Gaza Strip will just lead to Palestinian insurgency and more support for Hamas, and worse than Hamas. We need to learn the lessons from Lebanon in 1982, when we attacked southern Lebanon and conquered up to Beirut. When we first entered Lebanon, the Shiite villagers in south of Lebanon threw rice and candies at the Israeli soldiers, and months later were planting roadside bombs against the same Israeli soldiers that they celebrated their liberation from the control of the PLO in those days in southern Lebanon. So we need to work with the Palestinian people to make sure that they do engage in real reform, that they do hold elections for a democratic government that represents them. And we need to enter into negotiations which will be regionally based and internationally supported to create a more stable, more secure, more economically developed region where the Palestinians are players at a state level. No longer, I agree with Dan that the Oslo conception, the Oslo process failed. But let's face it, Dan, the Oslo process was supposed to be a 5-year interim agreement, not 30 years of negotiations on the question of Palestinian statehood. The Palestinian people never received the promise of independence and liberation that they thought they would get. They saw the continuation of Israeli control, the deepening of the occupation, the building of more settlements, the occupation of more land, and a siege on the Gaza Strip that was supposed to differentiate between the West Bank and Gaza.
All right, this is getting good. Dan, let me ask you this. Is there a vision moving forward that is supported by any part of the international community that does not include at least a demilitarized Palestinian state?
Steve, first of all, I want to just congratulate Dr. Baskin for his rhetorical eloquence. But it takes time to unpack all of the inaccuracies and disfigurements of even the Oslo Accords itself, which accorded rights to Israel that Israel had enjoyed, but the Palestinians had violated. To say that there are 7 million Palestinians is to conflate the 2 million Israeli Arabs together with 2 million Gazans and 1.6 or 1.7 million Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. So part of this is meant to create parity between Israel and the Palestinian issue, which is it's simply absurd from a legal point of view and from a political point of view. The bottom line is there is no Israeli today, other than perhaps one sitting as the Minister of Public Security, that has any intention of over many years reoccupying Gaza. The problem with Gaza is that Israel is going to have to. There is no one else. There is no international force. There is no Palestinian force. There is no Arab force that today will enter Gaza and secure Gaza to secure Gaza so that Israelis can live without the threat of ISIS terror sitting 1 kilometer from Israel's border.
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
I just want to ask about that specific point, Gershon. The Palestinian Authority was there before. They were expelled from Gaza in 2007 with a series of brutal lynchings. What would prevent an event where the PA runs things in Gaza, but remnants of Hamas return and murder them again, and then we're stuck with Hamas again?
I'm not suggesting that the PA of today go and take over Gaza. They control barely 30% of the West Bank, and we know that most Palestinians think that they're corrupt and inept and not legitimate in the eyes of the Palestinian people. There needs to be reform there, but any reform that takes place or any control over the Gaza Strip beyond an interim period of stabilization has to be Palestinian-led. If it is not Palestinian-led, it'll be treated by the Palestinian people as another form of occupation. And Dan's right, no country will go there, not the United States, not European countries, not Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, without it being Palestinian-led. So let's face it, with all the faults of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Authority and the lack of democracy that exists there, we are going to have to work with them together with the international community in order to create a situation where Gaza remains demilitarized and safe for Israel. In fact, when Palestinians do hold elections, we need to ensure, together with the Palestinian people in the world, that parties that support an arms struggle will not be allowed to participate in those elections. Democracies have a right to protect themselves, and the Palestinian people need to be aware that if they want to elect a democratic government, it needs to be a democratic government that's going to ensure peace for them and for Israel.
Let me go back to Dan. Dan, back in the day, when I was an IDF reservist, several times over 2 decades, I was assigned guard duty inside Gaza. Is that the fate of Israeli soldiers for the coming decades? Will there be a need for a long-term Israeli military presence or even a full occupation? I know you said that we don't favor a reoccupation, but could we fall into that trap?
Dave, let's first clarify the legal term of occupation, because the term has been misused, abused, raped, and pillaged. And I'm sorry to say, people like Gershon Baskin, who has deep sympathies for the Palestinian people, as do I, by the way, and I've had probably as many Palestinian contacts, who, by the way, the vast majority of Palestinian people are voting against Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. The polls show repeatedly that 85% of the Palestinian people want to get rid of the Palestinian Authority. And that is why the Palestinian people today are favoring the Hamas's re-election in any potential so-called democratic election in the Palestinian areas. But one has to be very clear. The concept of occupation doesn't exist here because there's no sovereign territory that is being administered. It's called security administration. There is nobody but the Israeli people that can secure their own future. And if we have to go into Gaza for the coming months until there emerges through all kinds of under-the-table relationships, some of which Gershon Baskin has himself, with the local families in Gaza. They're the ones that are going to secure Gaza. It must be an organically developed leadership district by district in Gaza. And Israel and Egypt and perhaps other Arab neighbors with which Israel has actually good relations will be responsible on various levels for national security. Israel and Gaza will have to share national security responsibilities, the same way that Israel and Jordan share national security responsibilities, each on his own side of the border in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. A similar model, in my view, could well be developed in Gaza.
All right, before we start running out of time, we have Gershon with us, and I want to take the time to do this. Gershon, you've been deeply interested in the hostage plight. You were very helpful in the deal for the release of Gilad Shalit. You'd said, I think, before the last round of hostage changes that you doubted that there could be another deal after the last one. Do you think that that's still the case, or where do you see the hostage deal going?
Yeah, I think it was a mistake not to continue, even though Hamas violated the initial agreement. It could have still gone on for additional days with additional pauses in the fighting while more hostages were returned, even if they were not the ones that we wanted first. There's a question of whether or not the young women, 14 or 15 young women between the ages of 20 and 30, are even alive, knowing what they have presumably gone through. I think that the only chance right now of another stage of hostage releases is if the Israelis initiate an offer to Hamas for something that they would have difficulty refusing. Let's look at the reality that there are more than 7,600 Palestinian prisoners today in Israel. Israel arrests hundreds of Palestinians every month. There's no shortage of Palestinians to arrest. I think that Israel should say that we want back the women, the elderly, the sick, and the wounded, and we are ready to, I'll throw out a number, to release 3,000 Palestinian prisoners. We will make the list. We will publish the list. Those names will appear in every Palestinian and Arab newspaper so that the psychological warfare moves from Israel to the Palestinian side, where Palestinian families see their loved ones on a list of names of people who could be released tomorrow. And the pressure internally within the prisons, within the West Bank, within Gaza, will emerge on the Hamas leadership to accept the deal. In reality, we need to face that the only way of getting back all the hostages alive, whoever is still alive, is the all-for-all deal, all the prisoners for all the hostages. And I don't see the Israeli government agreeing to that. Even though public pressure is building, there isn't enough time to have that deal emerge. And in the meantime, every day the hostages are in Gaza, they are being killed. We need to bring them home.
Dan, let me ask you a politically incorrect question, if I could. Wouldn't it be better if the hostage families would just stay home and not make as much publicity as they're doing? Just worry about your loved ones quietly. Lower the temperatures, and maybe we'll be able to get a better deal behind the scenes without so much noise. And is Israel willing to hand over murderers with blood on their hands, some of the worst Hamas murderers, like Sinwar types that were released in the Gilad Shalit deal? Will we be willing to release them all in order to get all the hostages back, and should we?
Steve, I think the context here of psychological warfare, deception warfare, disinformation by the ISIS-modeled Hamas is a very important conception with which to work with. It's an extraordinarily difficult situation when you have 137 or some such number of hostages. What is absolutely clear is that psychological pressure on the Hamas coming from the bottom doesn't affect them at all. They're not only are they not a democracy, but in this radical Islamic authoritarian society, their public pressure from the bottom really means very, very little, if zero. But in fact, they will take their orders to whatever degree from Qatar, and decisions will be made by Sinwar. I mean, Sinwar has done very well to sacrifice thousands and thousands of his own people, as he's been using them as human shields from the very beginning of Israel's counteroffensive in Gaza. This is the...
Dan, we're just about out of time, but I want both of you to have a chance to respond to this last question. Looking ahead, Gershon, I'll start with you. Let's say a year from now, where will things be at in Gaza?
I can tell you what I hope. I hope that Hamas will be decapitated Their leaders will be killed by Israel, their infrastructure destroyed, and we will be in the midst of the beginning of an international political process leading to the